Good day everybody, this is Kubus speaking, and today I'm going to talk about a few very important aspects to 3D modeling, and we're going to specifically talk about NURBS modeling. And what NURBS modeling essentially means is it makes use of curves to generate surfaces for us. So it's not working with polygons where you're working with vertices, edges and faces. We're actually generating things accordingly to a profile, and this profile that could then be manipulated accordingly, so we can actually generate a surface using this method. So what we specifically going to talk about is we're going to cover a few aspects regarding the NURBS that allows us to manipulate curves, manipulate how the curve works and how it reacts. And what I have in front of me is a little diagram that specifically indicates how the NURBS work. So for short, the NURBS essentially means non-uniform rational B-spline. And that is just a way of describing mathematical way of generating surface. So think of it as when you're working with pixels versus vectors, whereas a vector is mathematically generated and it allows us to make a better, cleaner decision on how the surface or the pixel is being displayed. So in geometry we work with something similar to vector versus if we're working with polygons, it's more like a pixel. Right, so the next thing is EP curves. An EP curve is a different type of curve. We have a few series of curves that we can make use of, and the EP curve stands for editable point. Now editable point is literally just the points on the curve that allows us to click away to generate the surface, and we can go into the option box if you want to manipulate how the EP curve is generated. So we will discuss that specifically in Maya when we get to that. The EP curve is quite different to how the CV curve works. So the CV curve itself stands for control vertex. Control vertex is just almost like a little bounding box wrapping around the surface or around the curve that then gets interpolated within those points. So again, you have options specifically for the control vertex to allow how the tool manipulates and works. So we can choose if you want a linear or if you want more cubic like generation of the curve. The next one is Bezier curve, and a Bezier curve is very similar to how Photoshop's pen tool works. Again, you have some options to go and change the way it's going to react, and the nice thing about the Bezier curves is it essentially makes use of little handles that we can pull to create more of a rounder profile versus if you want to work with a more sharper corner. Right, so after we've actually generated the curves, we want to have the ability to go and clean up some of the points. And the Edit Curves drop-down menu from the list allows us to change the way that the curve looks and feels and how clean it is, and if we want more points or less points. So the rebuild function is specifically just for that. It allows us to rebuild the curve using a different parametric length. We can make use of extra points. We can clean it up. We can distribute the points evenly across the length of the curve. There's many aspects to this rebuilding function that we can all make use of for cleaning up our curves. The next thing is we want to have the ability to reverse the curve if need be. If we, for instance, generate a curve in one direction and we create another curve in an opposite direction, when we generate a surface between those two curves, it might come out as an unexpected result. So we want to have the ability to reverse one curve to match the other. Then we're going to talk about attaching and detaching curves. We'll see if we get to finish or talk about all these options in this particular tutorial. We also want to have the ability to open and also close our curves if need be. The next thing that we will be talking about is actually revolving or generating surfaces from a particular curve or a series of curves. And the revolve function is pretty great. It allows us to center pivot around a curve profile, and based on that, based on the specific axes, we can actually generate a curve, or rather a surface, around that particular axis. So anything from a wine glass to a beer bottle to a rim tire, any of that kind of stuff we can do using the Revolve tool. So just keep that in mind, and that's, for the most part, we will be using this tool for this little tutorial. The next thing that we would like to talk about is actually discussing the loft tool. The loft is very great. It gives us the ability to essentially create a series of curves and then selecting them accordingly in an additive order, and then based on that selection of order we can actually generate a surface going from one curve to the next and so on. Right, from here we will also be able to fill the gaps on the top of the curve and essentially make it a planar surface. And so the NURBS tool is actually very smart enough. It's smart enough to kind of figure that out for us to fill those holes. Then we have an extrude tool. This one is very similar to how the extrude tool works for polygon modeling, but it works specifically only with NURBS. Finally, the bi-rail is another way of generating a surface that makes use of a profile as well as a directional curve, and through those series of selections we can build much more complex designs. Now, since we talked about how to generate a surface and how to generate a curve, we also have the ability to clean up the curves and clean up the surfaces. So we essentially need a curve to generate one, and then once we generate it, we can then manipulate how the surface is interpolated. So we will be able to project curves onto surfaces, trim holes, and make interesting looking designs. And then for the next part, we need to have the tools to essentially cut into objects, and that brings us to the trim tool. The trim tool is a way to manipulate how the projected curve reacts on the surface. So now that we covered all the aspects of manipulating surfaces, we're going to talk about the actual tools. So we start off with a for this project we're going to build the actual wine glass, and the wine glass is a very easy to manage project. So we're going to essentially start off with a clean scene. The first thing that I would like to talk about is let's talk about the different ways of creating curves. So for the most part, the CV curve tool has some options. If you go into the option box, that little checkbox on the side, I like to reset my settings, and then from there we can talk about the different ways of generating the curve. We've got different degrees, and we have linear, we've got 2, we've got 3 cubic, so on and so forth. And so each of those appear to give us a different way of how the curve tool is going to react. So by starting off with something like linear, for instance, we have the ability to go and switch from obviously linear to 3 cubic and so on. But the linear is essentially a pathway that we can go from one corner to the next in a very straight line. That's very nice if you want to build a surface that is very rigid or hard surface like, because you have these hard transitions between your points. Obviously, after you've created your curve, you want to press enter to initiate the generation of the curve. So I'm going to go back to the options and then click on 3 cubic. So I'm going to click on 3 cubic, and that's going to give us the ability to generate the curve using a slightly different algorithm. So how that works is by placing these points, you'll see the initial placement of your points going from 1 to the second, and then from the second to the third. It's going to generate this curve only after placing the 4th point. So you'll see the outer bounding box is essentially a way to make the curve interpolate in between those points. So that's like the bounding box. And as you keep clicking, you'll see these points kind of transitioning throughout a very linear path, but the generation of the curve is in between that. So that's the main difference between the linear versus the 3 cubic. So if we go back to the options and we go from the CV curve tool and go into the options for the next one, which is the EP curve tool, you'll see the same kind of set of options that we can play with. We've got the same linear, we've got same 3 cubic and so on, but these work slightly different. So the editable points on the linear EP curve is very similar to how the CV curve tool works in the same way. So if we switch to 3 cubic, you'll immediately notice the main difference is as soon as I place my first, second, and then third, immediately the curve gets generated accordingly. So there's no waiting period for the curve to generate the surface. It also, you'll see these points are placed right on top of the actual curve. So it's not those little bounding box points around the curve itself. So those are the main important aspects that we need to keep in mind. For the Bezier curve, it essentially works very much like the pen tool that I've already mentioned. As soon as you place a point in a straight line and you click and you let go, it changes into a smooth, like a hard profile. If you click and drag, it's going to give you more of a profile that allows us to transition into a smoother action. So you have the option of going either straight, linear, or 3 cubic within these options. You'll see the actual tool has a bit of options that we can have access to. So I'm going to close a window and click on the tool settings on the left hand side. If you double click on it, it's going to bring up the options, and you can always read what options you have to change the way how the tool works. So this is the wine glass that we will be generating for this little tutorial, and so we need to essentially start off with generating a curve to manipulate how the surface is going to be generated. So you'll see that for this wine glass we have a few points being distributed along the length of it. So I'm just storing all of these in different layers. And what I'm going to do now, before we actually get into the little project, is actually discuss creating a project. So I'm going to go to File. I'm going to go down to the project window. Inside of the project window, we need to talk about creating the actual project and where the project is being saved. So right there at the top, you'll see the project name. So I'm going to go and click on the New on the right hand side. So as soon as you do that, just click there. You're going to type in the name of the little project. For this project, I'm just going to call it New Wine Glass. And I'm going to just take out the little spaces in between. And now we're going to choose the path for where we want to save this. I'm going to click on the little pathway button. I'm going to go to my documents and just go to the tutorial project, and in there I'm going to create a new little project folder, and inside of it I'm just going to say select. So you'll see now that the project path is in the new folder, and the project name is called New Wine Glass. So each of these subfolders down there are referred to what's going to be generated as subfolders within my new wine glass project. I'm going to click accept. I'm going to open up my browser, my Explorer, and just quickly go to that specific path, and you can see the new wine glass with all its subfolders automatically generated for us. These are great and useful for us to store in very important information, from scene files to reference images to rendered images and so on. So I quickly want to jump back into there, and I'm going to copy some of my old reference images from my existing tutorial, and I'm going to put them in the new project. I'm going to go to the old wine glass, go to source images. I'm going to grab these images, quickly copy them. I'm going to cycle back to the new project folder, New Wine Glass, source images, and then paste those right in there. Right, I'm going to minimize, so close this window. You can see it's in the source images, very important, keep in mind. And now after you've created the project, Maya needs to know that we want to work within this project. So we have to go and say set the project. So File, set project, and I'm going to go from there to my new wine glass. Double click on that, and I'm going to say set here at the bottom. Right, so once we've done that, now Maya is aware that we want to save inside of this project. So as soon as I go to save as, you can actually see it go straight to the new wine glass folder, and then it opens up my project, and we can go and save the actual scene file in the scenes folder. I'm going to call this wine glass start underscore start. I'm going to say save as. There we go. Once I've done that, you'll see that the file is called new wine glass start, and it's saved inside of that new folder into new wine glass project. Right, so now everything is set up for us. We need to do one very important step, and that is essentially going to the front view, and I'm just going to close my tool settings, open up my front view, go to view there at the top, and then go to image plane and then import image. Right, now you'll see it's opening up straight into my source images folder. I'm going to pick my reference, I'm going to click open. Once I've opened it, I want to quickly zoom out a bit just to quickly see where my image plane is, and from here I want to make sure that I scale this up to the according size that I would like to work with, and then I'm going to line it up so that my first wine glass is right in the center of my grid. So that thick line running through the center is going to be my center line for the actual wine glass. So we're only going to make one half of the wine glass, and then using the tools accordingly to build the surface. So I'm going to take this reference image plane, and I'm going to take that and store that in a new layer. So by clicking on the last little icon in the top part of my layer stack, you can click on the that button is going to take the selected and store it in there. I'm also going to put it to reference. That allows me to not have it selected. That keeps it nice and safe so that I don't go and mess up anything when I start building the surface. Right, so it's referenced. I'm going to go to my EP curve tool. I'm going to go to obviously you can choose between the differences if you want CV curve or EP curve. It really doesn't matter which one you choose at the end of the day. So I'm going to start off with the EP curve. Just want to go back to the option box. I'm going to make sure it's set to 3 cubic, which it is. I'm going to close the options. I'm going to go and click away and start placing these points. Now as I do this, it is very important to note that wherever you place these points, if you place them closer to each other, they're going to give you the ability to create nice tight corners. If you start placing them further apart, it's going to distribute the points in a more lengthy kind of space out. As you can see at the bottom, it's kind of creating a very odd looking shape. So I'm going to undo backspace, backspace, backspace. I'm going to reposition these points a little bit closer to each other, and you can see that the transition is much sharper, much tighter now. And as I do that, I'm going to make my decision on where I want to place these points. Yeah, that should be good. These in this corner a little bit tighter. I'm going to click away, just follow the path. And you can see at the top we have a sharp corner. We want to make sure we transition with a little bit more points along that path. And that's going to keep it nice and tight for us. I'm going to follow the profile as we go up. And these are pretty much all equally spaced out, and here at the top we want to make sure we have a few extra points to give it a little bit sharper, tighter creasing. Right, so there we go. And I'm not going to go across. I'm not going to go all the way to the center line into the middle of the grid. I'm going to make sure I keep that, even though that's part of my reference image, I want to follow the path of the thickness of the wine glass. So I'm going to go down back to the same starting position, or pretty much the same starting position. And as I'm doing it, I'm actually looking at how far I initially placed my previous points. I'm going to try and match the knots to be pretty much similar, and then from here we want to make sure we end at the same point in the center of the grid as we did with the starting point. So I'm making sure I'm placing that last point right on the grid. So I'm hitting enter. That's going to initiate the curve, and you can see that curve is now created for us, and we can use that to do any manipulation. So before we actually start adding physical geometry, what I want to do is we need to change the amount of points on the curve. So first things first, before we changing the point count, I want to make sure I go to the component mode and then go to control vertex. Select the first point and then go into my grid snapping. So I'm going to go to the move tool, going to hold down X for grid snapping, and I'm going to move that point towards the middle line. I'm going to do exactly the same thing to the top. So I'm going to go to my front view and then hold down X and then click and drag my X axes towards the grid. And now it's a good time obviously to reposition these additional points if you feel like any of them have been shifted out of position. So there's just a few tweaks that here and there. If you want to space them out, grab some of them, moving them, distributing them, aligning them, and so on. Over here at the bottom, we want to move some of these points further apart, grab these, get the curvature looking nice and clean. If you're happy with the path, then you can go on to the next step. For now, I feel this bottom corner needs a little bit more tighter refinements. I'm going to tighten that up a little bit, grab these points, going to nudge them all up. Right, I think I'm happy with that. Just bring that down a little bit. There we go. Right, now that we have done that, I'm going to go right click on the curve and go to object mode. And from that, we want to take the actual curve now and make sure we go to the sub menu set for surfaces. So these are the different menu sets. We want to make sure we're on surfaces, and that's going to give us all the menus specifically for generating curves, manipulating curves, creating surfaces, and then manipulating those surfaces. So with a curve, I'm going to go and first of all go to the edit curves menu. So we talked about creating the curves using the create menu. So I'm going to go to edit curves, just tear that off and pull this down, and then from here we have all the tools that we need to manipulate the curve. For the most part, what we want to do is we want to check the count of all the points on this curve. Now that's going to take quite a bit of time. I don't want to go and right click, go to component mode and count all the points. There's an easier way to do this. What I want to do is I'm going to use the rebuild curve function, but before we do that, I need to know that the amount of points that I have is equal to whatever I need. So by going to edit, resetting the settings for the rebuild curve option box, I want to make sure that the amount of points is first of all noted, and then from there we can actually match the number of spans inside of the rebuild curve option box. We also want to make sure it's set to 3 cubic, and then from there accordingly we can choose how many points we want to match this with. Currently the default is set to 4, so I'm not going to use 4. I need to first take note of something else. So I could right click, count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on. That's going to take way too long. So instead of doing that, I'm going to go to the attribute editor. Inside of the attribute editor, you'll see the first tab, the shapes tab. It gives us a number of spans. That's called 49. So if I type in 49, that's going to be the equal number to what we currently have. So that's not what I want. I want to have them more evenly distributed, which means 45 is not going to be enough. I need to have a lot more with the same settings. I still want 3 cubic. I want them all uniformly spaced, so I'm going to use something like 100. I'm going to click apply, and you'll see some of these points might jot out just a little bit. They moved a little bit, and if we zoom in closer and we go to control vertex, you'll see immediately there's a lot more points being distributed along the length of the path. Some of them are a bit out from position, but that's easily manageable. We can always grab these points and move them around. So I'm just spacing these points out a bit. Grabbing these at the top, bring it down. That should be good. Bring that one in. These as well. Down here at the bottom, we also want to kind of bring that. And I'm going to tighten these corners. I'm going to pull these points closer to the bottom just to sharpen up the creasing just a bit more. That should be good. Happy with that. Right. Once you're happy, then we've got evenly spaced out points. Oh no. What I'm going to do now is we're going to go to the surfaces menu, and then from the surfaces menu I'm just going to tear that line off again, and we're going to make use of the first tool. So I'm going to open up the option box, and then from the option box we want to make sure we use the right axes, the axes that will allow us to rotate or generate the surface from. So we can choose X, Y, or Z, and we have to note which direction we want to generate it from and to. So also another very important aspect to keep in mind is the actual pivot placement. You'll notice that when I created the curve, I made sure that the image plane is in the center of the grid. So if the pivot point is off to the side, it's going to generate the surface based on that pivot point. So we want to make sure that the pivot point is nicely centered on the grid, or at least to the start or end point of the curve. That's going to allow us to revolve the surface around that particular axis. So if it's kind of spaced out a bit further, then you might find that it's not going to be as accurate as you initially expected. So first things first, I'm going to choose the y-axis, as that is the axis it's going to revolve around the center side of the wine glass. And we want to make sure that we obviously set the degrees to go from 0 to 360 degrees. And then from there, I'm going to use a default of 8. 8 for the segments is good enough to generate the surface. If we transition that to polygons, it might be a little bit different though. I'm going to hit apply. And as soon as I do that, you'll immediately see that it's revolving the wine glass around that particular axis, and it's very accurate. It starts and it stops exactly within that profile of the wine glass. Now if I had to undo and move this pivot point a little bit off to the side and hit apply again, you'll see that the wine glass, it's still using the same profile, but it's rotating or revolving the geometry based on the placement of that pivot point. So you will always want to make sure that the pivot point is nicely centered where you want it, and then based on that it's going to generate the surface accordingly. So we can go and convert it straight to polygons if you want, but NURBS for this case should be okay. I will discuss how we can actually generate polygons in one of the other tutorials afterwards. Right, for the most part this was the initial creation of the wine glass. Very easy, very simple, and I have to say there is a few additional things that we can keep in mind. If we go to the components, so if we click here at the top and we pick some of these points and we just start manipulating the points on the curve, you'll see that the profile of the wine glass is changing accordingly. So we can go and design any type of profile as we like on the fly and still be able to see the geometry being manipulated accordingly. Now some of these other profiles I would highly recommend you guys actually give this a try, is create some profiles and design them as you see fit. Some of these you can see is a nice swoopy motion, some of them are a little bit more curvy versus more sharp transitions. This one over here has more of a bulging effect at the top. So different type of wine glasses and different designs. You can do beer bottles, you can do anything you like at the end of the day. Right, I have to say this was quite a simple tutorial. For the next one, we will be discussing a little bit more complex things. But if you guys enjoyed this tutorial, then please subscribe and like my videos and share with everyone. And I will definitely see you guys in the next tutorial. Thanks for watching, and I will see you guys soon. Cheers.